On a scorching August morning in 216 BCE, the largest army Rome had ever assembled marched toward what would become the bloodiest single day in ancient warfare. 86,000 Roman soldiers, their bronze armor glinting in the Mediterranean sun, advanced across the dusty plains of southern Italy with absolute confidence. They were heading to a small village called Cannae, where a Carthaginian general waited with a force half their size. By sunset, the fields would be carpeted with so many Roman corpses that rivers literally ran red with blood, and the name Hannibal Barca would be whispered in terror across the known world. This is the story of tactical genius meeting Roman arrogance, where one man's brilliance turned superior numbers into a death trap, and where the most disciplined army on earth was butchered like sheep in a pen. What happened at Cannae defied every rule of ancient warfare and created a massacre so complete that it nearly brought the mighty Roman Republic to its knees. The road to this catastrophe began 3 years earlier, when a 26-year-old Carthaginian crossed the Alps with elephants, cavalry, and a burning desire for revenge. Hannibal Barca was not just any general. He was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a commander who had made Rome bleed during the First Punic War. From childhood, Hannibal had been raised on stories of Carthaginian glory and Roman treachery. His father had made him swear an oath before the gods that he would never be a friend to Rome. Now, as he carved his way through Italy like a hurricane, that oath was being paid in Roman blood. The year 218 BCE had seen Hannibal achieve what Romans thought impossible. He had led his army across the frozen peaks of the Alps, losing nearly half his men to cold, avalanches, and hostile tribes. But what remained was a hardened core of veterans from across the Mediterranean world. Spanish swordsmen with their curved falcatas, Gallic warriors wielding massive shields and iron swords, African spearmen with bronze-tipped pikes, and most terrifying of all, Numidian cavalry whose horses moved like ghosts across the battlefield. When this polyglot army descended into the Po Valley, Rome's first response was predictable. They sent armies to crush this upstart who dared invade the sacred soil of Italy. At the Trebia River in the 2nd of December 18, Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus learned the first lesson about Hannibal's genius the hard way. The Roman army, 40,000 strong, was lured into crossing an icy river on a winter morning. As the legionaries waded through chest-deep water that numbed their limbs and soaked their equipment, Hannibal's cavalry struck their flanks while a hidden force attacked their rear. 20,000 Romans died in the mud and ice, their blood steaming in the frigid air. The survivors who limped back to Rome brought tales that seemed impossible. How could disciplined Roman legions, the most feared infantry in the world, be outmaneuvered by a ragtag collection of barbarians and mercenaries? The answer lay not in the quality of Hannibal's troops, but in the mind of their commander. This was a general who thought 3 moves ahead, who could read terrain like a scroll, and who understood that in war, the mind was as important as the sword. Spring brought no respite. At Lake Trasimene in 217 BCE, Hannibal laid the largest ambush in military history. He positioned his army in the hills overlooking the lake, hidden by morning mist and vegetation. When the Roman army of Gaius Flaminius marched along the narrow shoreline, they walked into a killing ground. 15,000 Romans died without ever forming proper battle lines, trapped between Carthaginian spears and the dark waters of the lake. Flaminius himself was cut down in the melee, his head later sent to Carthage as proof of Hannibal's growing dominance. These defeats sent shockwaves through Roman society. For the first time in generations, enemy soldiers were burning Roman farms within sight of the city walls. Refugees flooded the roads, carrying tales of slaughter and destruction. In the Forum, senators debated frantically while mothers clutched their children and prayed to the gods for deliverance. Some called for negotiation, others for total war. But one voice rose above the chaos with a different strategy. Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator in Rome's hour of need, proposed something that went against every Roman instinct. Instead of seeking glorious battle, he would shadow Hannibal's army, harassing his supply lines and avoiding pitched combat. The strategy was sound but deeply unpopular. Romans had built their empire through aggressive warfare, not cautious maneuvering. Citizens mocked Fabius as a coward, calling him the delayer with contempt. Young aristocrats burned with shame, that Rome's eagles were retreating before a foreign invader. This frustration reached a boiling point in 216 BCE, when the consulship fell to two men who embodied opposite philosophies of war. Lucius Aemilius Paullus was a veteran soldier who understood the wisdom of caution. He had seen what happened to armies that underestimated Hannibal and knew that patience could be a weapon. But his co-consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, represented the fury of the Roman people. A man of humble origins who had clawed his way to power, Varro promised the citizens what they desperately wanted to hear. He would find Hannibal, he would fight him, and he would end this humiliating war with one decisive blow. The debate between these two men reflected the soul of Rome itself. Paullus argued for continuing Fabius's strategy, wearing down the enemy through attrition and avoiding the kind of set-piece battle where Hannibal's tactical genius could shine. But Varro's words found eager ears among senators tired of seeing their lands ravaged and their prestige diminished. Why should Rome, master of Italy and conqueror of nations, skulk in the hills like bandits? The legions were Rome's greatest weapon, forged through centuries of conquest. Let them be unleashed. The deciding moment came when reports reached Rome that Hannibal had seized the fortress at Cannae. This ancient stronghold controlled vast grain stores that fed much of southern Italy. Its capture threatened not just Roman supply lines, but the loyalty of Italian allies who might defect if they believed Rome could no longer protect them. Something had to be done, and Varro's aggressive approach suddenly seemed like necessity rather than recklessness. The Senate's decision would echo through history. They authorized the raising of the largest army Rome had ever fielded. 8 full legions, each containing over 5,000 men, plus an equal number of allied troops from across Italy. Seasoned veterans marched alongside fresh recruits barely old enough to hold a gladius. The cream of Roman society filled the officer ranks, senators and their sons eager to win glory in what many believed would be the war's final battle. As this massive force assembled outside Rome, the city buzzed with confidence. Surely no army could stand against such overwhelming numbers. Hannibal's victories had been won through trickery and surprise, but here on the open plains of southern Italy, Roman discipline and superior numbers would prevail. Veterans boasted of the plunder they would take from Carthaginian corpses. Young soldiers dreamed of the triumphs that awaited them when they returned with Hannibal's head. But as the great army marched south through the summer heat, Hannibal was already preparing his masterpiece. He had chosen his ground with the same care a sculptor chooses marble, studying every fold of terrain, every wind pattern, every advantage the landscape might offer. Near the village of Cannae, where the Aufidus River curved through flat plains, he would create a trap that would swallow the pride of Rome whole. The armies converged on Cannae like storm fronts approaching collision. Hannibal's scouts had been watching the Roman advance for days, counting banners and estimating numbers with the cold precision of men who knew their lives depended on accurate intelligence. What they reported back to their commander would have terrified any other general in the ancient world. The Romans were coming with over 80,000 men, a force that dwarfed anything Hannibal could field. But as the Carthaginian studied the reports, his weathered face showed no fear, only the calculating expression of a chess master seeing victory 20 moves ahead. The Roman army that approached Cannae was a sight to inspire both awe and terror. Legion after legion stretched across the Italian countryside, their bronze shields catching the sunlight like a river of molten metal. The steady tramp of hobnailed sandals on stone roads created a rhythm that could be heard for miles, punctuated by the creak of leather, the jangle of mail, and the occasional bark of orders from centurions keeping their men in formation. Standards bearing the eagle of Rome flew proudly above each unit, symbols of an empire that had never known permanent defeat. At the head of this host rode the 2 consuls, their purple cloaks marking them as the supreme commanders of Rome's might. But even here, in this moment of apparent unity, the fatal division between Paullus and Varro continued to fester. Roman tradition dictated that the consuls alternate command daily, a system designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. In normal circumstances, this arrangement worked well enough. But facing an enemy like Hannibal, who could exploit every weakness and hesitation, the divided command structure would prove catastrophic. Varro had spent the march south filling his soldiers' ears with promises of easy victory. He spoke of Hannibal as a desperate fugitive, cut off from reinforcement and supplies, commanding nothing but a collection of mercenaries and barbarians held together by fear and gold. Once these hired swords faced the disciplined steel of the legions, Varro declared, they would break and run like all of Rome's enemies eventually did. His words found eager listeners among the younger soldiers, men who had grown up on stories of Roman invincibility and burned to prove themselves worthy heirs to their father's glory. Paullus remained skeptical, his experienced eye seeing dangers that his colleague dismissed. He had studied the reports from Trebia and Trasimene, noting how Hannibal seemed to turn Roman strengths into weaknesses through superior positioning and timing. The Carthaginians' army might be smaller, but it was composed of veterans who had been fighting together for 3 years. They had learned to move as one organism, responding to their commander's will with the fluid precision of a school of fish changing direction. Against such an enemy, numbers alone might not be enough. When the Roman army finally came within sight of Cannae, the differences between the two commanders became even more pronounced. The ancient fortress sat on a hill overlooking the Aufidus River, its crumbling walls bearing witness to centuries of warfare. Below, on the flat plains beside the water, Hannibal's army waited in battle formation. From the Roman perspective, the Carthaginian force looked almost pathetically small. Surely this ragged collection of foreigners could not stand against the might of Rome's finest legions. But Hannibal had not chosen this ground by accident. The plains beside Cannae offered exactly what he needed for his plan to succeed. There was room for his cavalry to maneuver, space for the complex tactical movements he envisioned, and most importantly, terrain that would funnel the Romans into the killing ground he had prepared. The summer heat shimmered off the dusty earth, and the wind carried grit that would blow into Roman faces as they advanced. Every detail had been calculated, every advantage exploited. The night before the battle brought restless sleep to both camps. Roman soldiers cleaned their weapons and checked their armor, while centurions made final inspections of equipment. In the officers' tents, maps were studied and plans debated late into the night. Many of the younger tribunes spoke confidently of the glory that awaited them, but the veterans remained quiet, their scarred faces reflecting the firelight as they thought of battles past and comrades lost. Across the field, Hannibal's army prepared with the calm efficiency of professionals. Spanish swordsmen tested the edges of their curved blades, while Gallic warriors painted their faces with the blue woad that would terrify their enemies. The Numidian cavalry checked their horses' hooves and adjusted their light javelins, knowing that tomorrow their mobility would be crucial to their survival. In the center of the camp, African spearmen arranged their shields and pikes with methodical precision, these men forming the backbone of Hannibal's force. The general himself moved among his troops like a father among his children, speaking to each contingent in their own language. To the Gauls, he spoke of the Roman oppression of their kinsmen beyond the Alps. To the Spanish, he reminded them of the silver mines Rome had stolen from their homeland. To the Africans, he painted visions of the riches they would claim when the eagles fell. Each group heard what they needed to hear, their loyalty to their commander reinforced by his personal attention and his promise of victory. But it was with his officers that Hannibal shared his true masterpiece. Gathered in his tent as the stars wheeled overhead, these battle-hardened veterans listened as their commander outlined a plan so audacious that it seemed to border on madness. Instead of meeting the Romans head-on, where their superior numbers could overwhelm his smaller force, Hannibal would invite them to attack his weakest point. He would place his least reliable troops, the newly recruited Gauls and Spanish, in the center of his line, deliberately allowing them to give ground under Roman pressure. Meanwhile, his elite African infantry would wait on the flanks, hidden behind the advancing Romans' field of vision. As the legions pushed forward, believing they were winning, Hannibal's cavalry would crush the Roman horsemen and swing around to attack from behind. The Africans would then close in from the sides, creating a perfect encirclement. It was a plan that required split-second timing, absolute trust between commanders, and nerves of steel from every soldier involved. One mistake, one moment of panic, and the entire Carthaginian army would be destroyed. Dawn broke clear and hot over the plains of Cannae, the August sun promising another day of scorching heat. Across both camps, trumpets sounded the call to arms as soldiers stumbled from their tents and began the familiar rituals of preparation. Weapons were blessed, armor was donned, and final prayers were offered to the gods of war. The greatest battle of the ancient world was about to begin. As the morning mist lifted from the Aufidus River, Hannibal stood on a low rise surveying the field, where he would either achieve immortality or meet his doom. His weathered hands traced the contours of the terrain one final time, every fold of earth and bend of the river committed to memory. This was the moment he had been preparing for since childhood, when his father had first whispered tales of Roman treachery and Carthaginian honor. Today, the oath sworn before the gods would be fulfilled in blood and steel. The Carthaginian deployment was a work of art, disguised as military necessity. In the center, Hannibal placed his most expendable troops, the recently recruited Gauls and Spanish warriors, whose loyalty was measured in gold rather than conviction. These men would bear the brunt of the Roman assault, their role not to win, but to die slowly and convincingly. Behind them, concealed from Roman view, waited the real strength of Hannibal's army. His African veterans, men who had marched with him across the Alps and stood firm at Trebia and Trasimene, formed two solid blocks on either flank. These warriors wore Roman armor stripped from previous battlefields, their bronze breastplates and red shields, creating a deliberate illusion that would prove crucial in the coming hours. On the wings, Hannibal's cavalry prepared for the most important mission of their lives. The Numidian horsemen, dark-skinned masters of mobility, adjusted their light javelins and checked their mounts with the casual confidence of men born in the saddle. Beside them, Spanish and Gallic cavalry in heavier armor waited for the signal to charge. These mounted warriors would serve as the hammer that would drive the Roman anvil into pieces, but first they had to shatter the enemy horsemen, who protected the legion's flanks. The Roman deployment reflected everything that made their army both magnificent and vulnerable. Consul Varro, commanding on this fateful day, had arranged his forces in the traditional manner, but with a crucial modification that would prove disastrous. Instead of the usual spacing that allowed for tactical flexibility, he had compressed his legions into a dense formation that stretched across the narrow plain like a human battering ram. The decision seemed logical given their overwhelming numerical advantage. Why allow gaps that the enemy might exploit, when raw weight could simply crush through any opposition? 80,000 Roman soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder in ranks so tight that men could barely move their sword arms. The hastati, young warriors in their first campaigns, formed the front lines with their oval shields and short gladii. Behind them came the princeps, seasoned veterans in the prime of their fighting years, their mail armor glinting in the morning sunday. At the rear stood the triarii, grizzled old soldiers whose long spears would serve as the army's final reserve. It was a formation that had conquered the Mediterranean, but today it would become a trap of Rome's own making. Between the two armies, the space of perhaps 300 yards shimmered with heat and tension. Dust devils danced across the packed earth while carrion birds circled overhead, sensing the feast to come. The silence was broken only by the occasional whinny of horses and the distant sound of the river flowing toward the sea. Both sides knew that within hours, this peaceful plain would be transformed into a charnel house that would haunt men's dreams for generations. The battle began with the clash of cavalry on both flanks, a thunderous collision of horse and rider that sent echoes rolling across the countryside like approaching thunder. Roman horsemen, brave but outclassed, found themselves overwhelmed by the superior skill and numbers of their Carthaginian counterparts. The Numidians darted in and out like wasps, their javelins finding gaps in Roman armor before wheeling away from counterattacks. On the Roman right, Spanish cavalry smashed through their opponents with the fury of men fighting for their homeland's honor. As the cavalry battle raged, Hannibal gave the signal for his infantry to advance. The Gallic and Spanish warriors in his center moved forward with wild cries and clashing weapons, their colorful shields and streaming hair creating a spectacle both magnificent and terrifying. These men knew they were expendable, but they advanced anyway, driven by gold, glory, and the magnetic personality of their commander. Behind them, invisible to Roman eyes, the African veterans waited with the patience of hunters. The Roman response was predictable and devastating. Varro's legions surged forward like a human avalanche, their disciplined ranks maintaining perfect formation as they closed the distance. The sound of ebb-nailed sandals striking 80,000 hoe earth in unison created a rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. Centurions barked orders, while trumpeters sounded the advance, their bronze instruments adding a martial melody to the symphony of approaching doom. When the lines collided, the impact was felt for miles around. Spears shattered, shields split, and the air filled with the screams of wounded men and horses. The Gallic and Spanish warriors in Hannibal's center fought with desperate courage, knowing that their survival depended on selling their lives as dearly as possible. But they were facing the finest heavy infantry in the world, men trained from childhood in the art of close combat and backed by an empire's resources. Slowly, inevitably, the Roman pressure began to tell. The Carthaginian center started to bend backward like a bow under strain, Gallic chieftains falling beneath Roman swords, while Spanish nobles died with their fathers' names on their lips. To the watching Romans, it seemed that victory was within their grasp. The enemy line was breaking, their colorful banners falling one by one as the legions pressed forward with relentless determination. But this apparent collapse was exactly what Hannibal had planned. As his center gave ground, the Roman formation began to change shape, the tight ranks stretching and distorting as they pursued what they believed was a beaten foe. The legionaries in the front ranks, drunk on the prospect of victory, pushed deeper into the growing gap, while their comrades followed, drawn forward by the irresistible momentum of the charge. The genius of Hannibal's trap lay not in its complexity, but in its exploitation of Roman psychology. These were soldiers trained to attack, to press forward regardless of danger or cost. The idea of tactical withdrawal was foreign to their nature, just as foreign as the concept that an enemy might deliberately appear weak to draw them into danger. Step by step, yard by bloody yard, the cream of Rome's army marched deeper into the killing ground their enemy had prepared. On the flanks, the Carthaginian cavalry completed their destruction of the Roman horsemen with methodical efficiency. Those Romans who were not cut down in the initial charge found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed, their bodies joining the growing pile of corpses that marked the boundaries of the battlefield. With the enemy cavalry eliminated, Hannibal's mounted warriors were free to execute the most crucial part of their commander's plan. The African infantry, silent and deadly as serpents, began their own advance. These men moved with the fluid precision of a machine, their shields locked together and their spears angled forward in a forest of bronze points. Unlike the wild charge of their Gallic and Spanish comrades, this was controlled violence, directed by a tactical genius who understood that timing was everything. Too early, and the Romans might escape. Too late, and the center would collapse before the trap could close. As the Roman legions continued their seemingly victorious advance, few noticed the subtle changes taking place around them. The Carthaginian line was no longer straight but curved inward like a crescent moon, with the Romans forming the focus of its deadly embrace. The plain that had seemed so spacious at dawn now felt constricted, hemmed in by enemy formations that appeared to grow stronger even as their center weakened. The moment of truth arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike. Hannibal's African veterans, fresh and unengaged while the Romans exhausted themselves against the center, wheeled inward like the closing jaws of a massive trap. At the same time, the Carthaginian cavalry, having swept the field clear of enemy horsemen, thundered around to strike the Roman rear. In an instant, the nature of the battle changed completely. The Roman legions, compressed into an ever-tightening space, found themselves attacked from all directions simultaneously. Men who had been advancing in triumph moments before now struggled simply to turn around, hemmed in by their own comrades and assaulted by enemies they could not see. The perfect discipline that had made Rome's army invincible became its greatest weakness as soldiers found themselves unable to maneuver or retreat. Panic, that most contagious of emotions, began to spread through the Roman ranks like wildfire. Veterans who had faced death a dozen times found themselves paralyzed by the impossibility of their situation, while younger soldiers simply broke and ran, trampling their comrades in their desperate flight. The systematic destruction that followed would be remembered as the most complete tactical victory in military history, a masterpiece of generalship that turned Rome's greatest strength into its most fatal weakness. The massacre at Cannae stands as history's most perfect example of tactical genius triumphing over brute force. Hannibal's double envelopment became the gold standard studied in military academies worldwide, while Rome's darkest day ultimately forged the empire that would conquer the ancient world. Sometimes the greatest defeats teach the most valuable lessons,